Welcome to Chapter 5. This chapter takes us to the very, very micro level of society. It takes us down to the individual. Socialization, of course, is the process, or tries to answer the question of how does culture become part of who we are and how we act. I've divided these two PowerPoints. Actually, there'll be 3 PowerPoints in this particular lecture because I think it's very important that we understand exactly what is happening here. Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to kind of introduce some ideas, explaining exactly what socialization is and why it is important. It's important both to the individual, but also to human society. Sociologists have a concept called the self. So I'm going to explain a little bit about that and how sociologists see it being created. One thing I've also included in this lecture is the nature versus nurture controversy. I'm using the video of Jeannie as an example of that. We're going to distinguish between psychological and sociological approaches, really to show how perhaps we need both explanations, that maybe the two should work more closely together, but that's just my opinion going there. Okay, so what are we talking about in terms of socialization? First of all, it's a process. Again, I always emphasize process because I don't want people to think that it happens in one day or 1 week or one time. It is something, as we will see, that continues throughout a person's life. However, it is more intense in the early years because of the development of the brain and the muscles and the physical part of the body. But all of these require a process of learning which involves the values, beliefs, and norms of the social group we live in. As I said, it begins in infancy, it lasts throughout the lifetime. Yes, we are born with genetics and biological traits, but how they develop is going to depend on the social world in which we live. One thing that we'll also talk about is that language facilitates socialization. Again, it does not have to be a spoken language. It can be communication through symbols or gestures. This is the concept of the self, which I mentioned a few slides ago. Sociologists refer to the individual personality, this personal identity that we establish as the self. And this self is different from all other people. We are individuals. As I said, we are very much on the macro level at this point. Sociologists see the self as being created through social interaction. And as I said, it's over the lifespan. It can be modified. It can be changed. How much or when is still a matter of controversy, research, a continuing understanding of the self. But one of the interesting things that we'll see is that sociologists do not see the self as existing before birth, which is a little bit different from some of the thinking in psychology. This idea of which is most responsible, either or, nature or nurture, nature meaning what is given to us in genetics or through our biological traits. Nurture means what is given to us by the environment, by the social interaction. I included a little clip here, and you might take a close look at that, from 1926. I don't know the newspaper, I just found this in some of the images that I was looking for. And it says, heredity is a big problem. A home for the feeble-minded is filled with those whose parents were not as carefully selected as dairymen breed cattle. This points to a very interesting historical movement in the United States. It was called the Eugenics movement. It started in the early 1900s and essentially built on this idea that nature, what we inherit from our parents and grandparents and through the genetic line, is most important for how people act and who they are, etc. It was so influential in the society that many states, I think the majority of states, passed legislation in which certain people were required to be sterilized so they could not have children. Certainly, what was included in this legislation were those who were considered to be, quote, feeble-minded, unquote, meaning maybe not mentally developed, or what in general was called at that time retarded. But also it would include people who were poverty-stricken, people who were poor. If more than one generation was poor, that person could be, in some states, legally sterilized so that poverty would not be passed along or criminal activity would not be passed along. Some of this legislation was still on the books in states like Virginia until the 1970s. So this was a very serious movement. The other extreme, which was very popular at the time, was called behaviorism, which we know as conditioning. And the very famous little Albert experiments reflected this type of thinking, where children were to be conditioned to be afraid of something or not be afraid, etc. It followed the thinking of Pavlov, who was a Russian psychologist, and his experiments that he did with dogs. But this controversy has never really died away. There still is people who swing to both sides of this particular thinking. As I said, there are basically two approaches: the psychological, which is how the mind influences behavior. Essentially, psychologists are looking inward to mental health, emotional processes along the way. It has become even more a central point in psychology today because of the increasing knowledge of DNA and how the mind works, and also being able to see some of the X-rays, images that are possible to look at the mind and other functioning today. Sociologists have remained, as they started, with the role of society in shaping behavior. In other words, they're looking outward from the person to understand, again, that connection, that sociological imagination, that connection between the individual behavior and the larger social world in which they live. There, of course, is a field that merges both social psychology. There's also a field in sociology, it's called biosociology, which also tries to connect the two together, looking more at the biological and connecting it to the sociological. So what I want to do in this first part of looking at this chapter, I'm going to discuss three of the psychological theories, the ones that are in the textbook, and ask the question, well, how might these theories help us to understand Jeannie's story? Without a doubt, I think Freud was the greatest influence at that particular time on the development of psychology. And even today, his approach, his ideas still have influence. I cannot say that I am a great fan of Freud because I don't think his work has a lot of empirical evidence behind it. But essentially, he identified three parts of the personality, or this self that we're trying to get to. He called them the id, the ego, and the superego. The id he saw as being the biological. He talks about instincts. He talks about drives, like the hunger drive, the sexual drive. He put a lot of emphasis on sexual, which I think made his theory, very exciting to people at that time, because sex was not a conversation that was likely to happen in the early 1900s. The superego is really what is developed, is the social world out there, the part of the personality that is going to have to deal with the rules of society. And you have to remember, we're talking about again, a very restrained society, the Victorian period of time. And so this is why the emphasis on the sexual, because he felt the society was not dealing with it. So the superego, the societal part, and the id, the physical part, then come together through a linear development, and he lists all the stages that people go through, to begin to form a unique person, which is the ego. Okay. What Freud felt was that if a person got stuck in any one of these stages, that the ego was not going to develop properly, and so they would need psychotherapy to help them to get through that particular stage. Okay, like I said, not very much empirical evidence here, but a great influence on psychology and its development at that time and even later. Erickson follows the general thinking of Freud. This idea that there are stages that people go through, but he identified 8 stages, and at least he extended the period of time from birth to death. He does say that there is an identity crisis in each stage. This is kind of where we get that term, which became very popular, identity crisis. So he sees this linear development. He sees the personality as continuing to change, really never completely being finished. Fortunately, he does put more emphasis on social aspects, but what he sees again is the type of thing that Freud saw, which was that negotiation, the physical, the innate, meaning like instincts, negotiating with the social world. Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist, have a heavy influence on education. He looked at the cognitive development of children, that their thinking develops in the same way that their bodies develop, like the physical development has stages. He again sees the self negotiating with the social world. So there is in all 3 of these psychologists kind of the understanding or the implied understanding that something exists when the child is born, that they bring with them these innate abilities, instincts, genetics, whatever, varies across the field, but they negotiate with the social world. Okay, so the self he saw evolving through negotiation with the social world, but he did see the perception being different for every person. So the social world as it exists in the child's mind and as it is experienced. When I say that he has a great influence on education, one of his most famous students was Maria Montessori, who of course developed the Montessori schools and a particular type of education in which there is a great deal more emphasis on interaction with the social world. Okay, let's look at Jeannie's situation from the short piece of the video that I asked you to watch. One of the first things that the psychologist did was to examine her brain functioning. Remember, they did the sleep studies where they were looking at the patterns that her brain might form while she was sleeping. So the question becomes, was Jeannie retarded at birth? This was something that her father thought, so he hid her away. I'm not sure that that was anything other than an excuse. But again, the psychologists are looking at what is the brain and how does it function. Then I think one of the statements that was made was, does she have the ability to form relationships? The psychologist that was interviewed in the video thought that was a very important thing, that if she had this ability to form relationships, then she may be able to progress into higher stages of development. Well, Freud might say that her id existed, her physical part, what she was born with, but did not interact with the superego, the social world around her. So an ego never emerged. Erickson might acknowledge her lack of knowledge of social norms, because what is essentially happening from Freud to Erickson is that there is more acknowledgement that the social world matters. But if her brain doesn't function, then how can she know about these social norms? So it becomes kind of a going around in circles. Piaget might say that Jeannie lacks social experience. And in that sense, by giving her social experience, she might be able to form some level of a personality or an individual learning, some cognitive experience. Now, don't hold me responsible for any of this. I'm just trying to think out loud, to the best of my understanding of these three gentlemen, what they might have said or how they might have tried to help Jeannie in progression. Okay, this ends our first part of this chapter. Some things I want you to remember: the socialization process is lifelong. That's what I mean by process. Controversy between nature and nurture has existed for a very long time as to which one is more important to this process of socialization. Psychologists and sociologists both examine the process, but they do take a different approach. And in our next lecture, we'll look at sociologists. Most of psychological approaches would examine first the biological factors, the physical, particularly the brain, before they begin to look at the social factors.